All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I'm looking forward to my conversation today because we're going to be talking about accessibility and neurodiversity and how technology can actually help us do better when it comes to education, especially with people who are struggling with cognitive challenges that have historically made this very difficult. So to navigate this conversation, I'm joined by Dr. Coral Ho, who is the co-founder of Dysolve. And we're going to talk about how AI is playing a leading role in this. So thank you so much for joining me, Coral.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, so little bit of backstory, because we don't have to go on the whole trip down memory lane, but I am actually really curious because backstage you were talking a little bit about how you started in kind of the academic consultancy space, and now you're in the technology space using AI on this. So what is your background and how did you get into this and why do you care about it?
Well, Christopher, I have a PhD in linguistics,
Okay.
and I ended up working with just children and adults with all sorts of brain conditions, language
Yeah.
processing difficulties. And it's because of that work I realized that I do have to go with AI.
Okay.
But I've always been interested in AI. AI is not something new. That's what people
No,
are
it's
saying
not.
because of all that, all the
They
news.
think it just came out in 2022, and it didn't. It's been around for a lot longer than that.
Right, because I was interested in it when I was in graduate school. But
Okay.
linguistics is the field where we look at linguistic clues, whether it's what somebody is saying, how somebody is saying something or not saying something, or errors that they make. We look at all those clues to see what's going on inside the brain.
Okay.
Um,
It's
so
all about
that,
patterning. It makes sense
right,
that you would
that's
like
right,
AI. You're looking for the patterns
that's
in
right.
people's linguistics and going, hey, what can we see in here that helps tell a bigger story of what's actually going on up here?
That's right. And so, looking at, people with all sorts of brain conditions, right? Especially when they're language based, and then going to AI is really not that big a jump for me. It's because,
No.
when you're in linguistics, you see the complexity of the linguistic system in the brain that, you really have to go down to the very granular level. Right.
Yeah.
And at that level of precision, then you can start identifying the root causes of all these different brain conditions like dyslexia, and
Yeah.
then start to correct that incrementally. And the process is not that different from physical therapy, right? You just have to
No.
have the right kind of exercises and target the right area.
Yeah.
Then, they have to work on it daily, weekly, right? And after a while, then these limits are extended, right? Whether you're talking
Yeah.
about physical limits or mental limits.
You know, what's really interesting about talking about this is when you make the comparison to physical therapy, um, it's interesting because there are a lot of parallels to this, but one of the challenges that I have to imagine in linguistics that you were dealing with is unlike physical therapy, where if somebody's got something with the way they walk, it's very visible, observable, and you don't necessarily need to see millions and millions of data points to figure it out. You can kind of go, I see what this is and I know what we need to do. But
Mm.
with linguistics, there's so much going on in people's heads. You actually have to look at a lot of different data to be able to see all this, which to me makes even more sense why you'd get into the AI space, because looking at that amount of information, trying to find all those patterns, it's more than a human being has the capacity to do. But AI is so much easier to be like, well, I can look at all that information, then help you make sense of it.
That's right. And that's why we built Dissolve AI, right? Because during its interaction with a student, during gameplay, it can do all this cross-referencing of billions of data points and actually build up that user's database in real
Yeah.
time. All right. And then react immediately, right? What's the next evaluative game that has to be designed right now and delivered? All right. And during
Yes.
that process, then do the next one and the next one, whether it's evaluation or correction, right? No human being can do this. All right. And
No,
that's why
we aren't even capable of it. It's
that's
not even like we could. It's like we can't do
yes.
it.
All right, just the sheer capacity complexity and speed of processing that's required. So we have to turn to AI. And I'd like schools to pay attention to your podcast and understand, where we're coming from and why, just like I'm not happy with the situation, because these current methods that they're still pushing and asking taxpayers to pay a lot of money for, they have never worked, and they have not worked for
They
the
have never worked.
100 years. So you cannot go to legislators and say, pass a law and do this when it has never worked. Somebody's got to look at the science of it, right? Even though they call it the science of reading, right? Like, for example, in the science of reading, they're asking, teachers to teach more intensively phonics to students who are struggling, right? It makes sense for typically developing children that you need to have phonics because you have to connect letters to sounds for the alphabet, right? But the children who come to Dysolve, they tell us that it doesn't make sense to them because they cannot process language. So you can't just make them do it more and more intensively and more than other students, because it becomes harmful. All right, it becomes harmful, and we see it firsthand, right? Because the child feels so bad that after all the teachers' effort, and now like 8 teachers working on that one child, right? And seeing that, she's still failing. How bad do you think the child feels? And to do that to the child year after year, it has a really, really harmful effect. It's not that it's not effective, it is harmful. And that's why our team did this. We built this program for the past 10 years with a lot of sacrifices, mind you, right? Because we're doing it for the children, and we feel that something's got to change, right? We cannot be doing the same thing over and over again, or asking taxpayers to pay so much. Everybody should look at their school budget, right? How much of it goes into special ed? What are the outcomes, right? Most school districts cannot meet state standards for students in special ed.
What's interesting about that 2 things that you brought up that we joked a little bit backstage that people might get a little feisty about our conversation, but I think 2 of the things that can help mitigate that for folks who may be listening and may be feeling a little frustrated, because some of it goes back to this sense of protectedness of, hey, we're trying here. And I think the thing that I observed, I got my start as a middle school math and computer teacher. And part of my frustration with this was, it's not out of a lack of trying, and sometimes people get defensive when they hear these new emerging things like, what are you saying? I'm not doing a good job. And it's like, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, going back to what you said before, it's just broken. And so I get you're putting a lot of work and you're trying to do your best, but it's a broken system. And while the school academic system works for your average person, maybe does okay, it doesn't work well when you have the exceptions. And unfortunately, I get it, because sometimes I have lots of teacher friends who go, well, what am I supposed to do? And unfortunately, in the past, there really wasn't a whole lot you could do because of capacity, scale, technology. So I get it. And sometimes people feel like the finger's being pointed at them, like, you did this. And it's like,
no,
it's not a finger pointing.
No,
you were doing the best you could for the time that you had and the space that you were in. But we're in a new age now where we can do better. And it's not taking away from what you were doing. Because like you said before, with the way the AI works, you don't have the human capacity to do it. We're not taking from you. We're simply saying this is a need you can't meet that can now be met by technology.
And that's what I want to tell teachers too, if they're listening in, that this helps teachers, right? Because they themselves are also frustrated, right? After all the work that they're putting in year after year, the students still cannot get helped if they have a reading difficulty or dyslexia, right? And so, they cannot do this because Dysolve AI has to come in at the very basic brain processing level that schools don't get into. Clear those deficits first so that teachers can teach the skills and have students acquire that effectively. I understand that teachers might feel that they cannot come right out and say the method doesn't work, right? But we did meet a group in Kansas, and the teachers did say this, right? We are doing what we've been told to do with high fidelity, right? and it doesn't work, right? So I understand that other teachers may not feel comfortable coming forward because they don't know if somebody will accuse them of not doing it with
Yep.
high fidelity, right? So
Yeah.
be honest, it's not working, right? It will never
Right.
work
And
because
that's just it. I think a lot of these things in the AI space right now are messing. I mean, we're talking a lot about what's going on in people's brains. It's
Mhm,
messing with people on a lot of levels because there's a lot of things that we've always done because that's just like, what other options did you have?
mhm,
And so people are seeing AI coming in doing this, and
mhm,
there is this resistance to saying what we were doing wasn't working because it can feel like failure, like you failed. And it's like, well,
mhm.
you didn't fail.
Right.
It's just you were doing the best you could with what you had. But
Mhm,
now there's a better option that you didn't know about. And helping people understand that it's like, it's it's everybody wins. Nobody's winning in this broken system where
That's
students feel like they're losing because they're trying hard, hard, hard. They're getting told you're failing.
mhm.
Teachers are exasperated because they're trying, trying, trying. It's not going. I mean, nobody's winning in the current system.
That's right. And just to make it easy to understand, right, let's think about this as three layers. So we're coming in for brain processing at the bottom layer, right? And
Yeah.
these processes have to work before skills can be acquired. That's where teachers
Yes.
come in. And the skills are needed like reading, spelling, writing, and math, right? So that you can acquire the content, right? So there are these three layers. The bottom layer, nobody got in before us. So
Yeah.
that's where we're coming in. And there's also a shortage of teacher resource after the pandemic.
Yeah, there is.
So schools are struggling to accommodate everybody. And even before the pandemic, students with dyslexia, half of them were not given any special services at all because it was just too costly to do it
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Yes. So now we can
Yeah.
afford
Well, and
everyone.
I love that I love the analogy you did with that there too, because like I was just in my head visually seeing this where what you're talking about, where AI is coming in to help. And I just see this not just in teachers, but everywhere. There's a
Mhm,
little bit of fear from people about, is AI taking what I do well? And what you just described right there is no, it's not, because essentially it's like if the wires are cut on a power cord and you're trying to run something. It's like, well, but if
right,
the wires are
right,
cut, you could be the best at whatever it is. You're not getting power to that
right,
thing. And this is
right.
actually closing that so you can do those other things and do it really well. It's not
Mhm.
in competition. If anything, it's in concert with things.
Right. And so, we are rewiring the brain in a way, if you want to continue with that analogy, right? Rewiring the brain for learners who had trouble learning before. So
Yeah.
now they
They
can,
never had the neural pathways that actually allowed them to
right.
do that.
And now, internally, when we look at the Dysolve AI generated data, we can see a lot more about the brain, how it works. You get to push and push and push, and then all of a sudden the pathway is clear. And it's not just one pathway, a lot of pathways clear at the same time. So it's very dramatic when you look at the student, right, at a personal level. Just within 1 week, that change happens and everybody notices it. The teachers, the parents, everybody around the child notices that the child has changed.
So I'm actually really curious about this because what you just described has to be, I mean, the positive benefits of this are far more than just, oh, you've improved their ability to read. Because going
Mhm,
back to what we said,
mhm,
the social, the cognitive, the
right.
psychological
Mhm.
implications of this stuff, the shame that
Yes,
probably, I mean,
right.
you look now at even just literacy rates in America, they're pretty low. And there's a lot of shame that goes along
Right,
with that.
right.
But it's interesting to hear you say that. So when students go through this, it is like carving a new pathway, but once it presses through, it actually just opens up
Everything,
completely new
everything.
pathways.
All right. And that's why we wrote the book, Dyslexia Dissolved. Where do I have it? Maybe here. All right. Dyslexia Dissolved. All right. Because in here, then we describe the different cases in detail, right? And the children themselves tell their own stories, the parents too, so that you can see how the whole person changes, just like what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
And the examples that are given. Like, for example, if somebody's struggling with language, it's not just reading, it's also being
No.
able to remember things, and then people think that they're not really that smart, right? Because they cannot even remember simple oral instructions, right? That gets affected as well. And then
Oh
also,
yeah.
the fear of taking on new things. So a lot of them dare not try new things, right? Until the processing efficiency gets to that level where it's not a problem when you have, new things and you don't have to just follow routine. You can take
Yeah.
on big new adventures, travel abroad and things like that. But a lot of the children that we saw at the beginning, they dare not venture far.
It's really funny you bring this up because, and it wasn't even related to us recording this podcast, but I was having a conversation similar to this with
Uh-huh.
just a random person I know who has struggled with dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that just opened my eyes to the tentacles that these kind of brain disorders can have on somebody's entire life was they described the anxiety they have
Mm.
going to a restaurant
Yeah.
because if it's not a familiar restaurant,
Right.
they don't know how to necessarily process the menu. And it's very uncomfortable for them to even know what to order. And so as a result, they don't even like going out to social things because the anxiety of, I might not know what's on the menu. I might not know how to read it. I
Mhm.
feel embarrassed asking people.
Right.
And so they've had to build a whole social
Yeah.
structure
Right.
around something as simple as that somebody else would just take for granted of just, well,
Yeah.
just what do you want to eat? And they're like, I don't know because I don't know what's on the menu. And now I feel
Hmm.
it just blew my mind when I was like,
Yes.
wow, I had never put myself in
Right.
those shoes, but I
Right.
can see how that would have implications across the board.
That's why we describe the cases in detail so that even teachers can see the other side of what's going on with the students, right? Because in the classroom, we only see one role. But just to continue with the restaurant example that you gave, one of the students, who used Dissolve as a college student, so he's in his 20s, right? We can accommodate older individuals as well. So he said that he couldn't actually take on as his part-time job while he's still in college, serving at a restaurant. He couldn't do it. Why not? Because he couldn't take down orders. First of all, he couldn't process what people were saying. And then to
Yep.
spell that out, he couldn't do that. Now he can. That was just after a couple of months of Dissolve.
And it's those kinds of things that I don't think people always consider when they consider how these disorders and just how these things and not talking about them and not
Right.
addressing them. I mean, this person that I was having this conversation with, they
Mhm.
had not told really anybody that
Mhm.
they struggled with this their whole life because they
Mhm.
just had accepted
Mhm.
this is just how it is. And they grew up in school and they were just told, well, you just figure it out. And nobody was really able to do anything. And it was a very hopeless feeling for them to feel like, what really can I even do at this point? So to hear the technology is
Right.
actually not only just doing the same thing we've done before, but maybe more efficiently, but going, no, we're actually reconnecting the neural pathways in a different way. We're actually solving the problem. We're not just creating bridges and barriers to kind of fix it.
Right, right. And so I would encourage everyone who is facing this difficulty, regardless of age, to just get the evaluation, right? So I'm pretty sure they've wondered all their lives, right, as to why they're having these difficulties, and there's so much shame that a lot of people don't want to
There's a
talk
lot
about
of
it,
shame.
right? So then just go to dissolve.com, just get the evaluation, even if you don't go on to have the correction done, right? Because that takes about just 2 weeks. If they work on it maybe 15 minutes a day, 3 to 5 days out of the week, only because they can see precisely where the processing inefficiencies are and the level of severity. But I also want to tell high school students and adults too that their problems are actually pretty clearly defined by then, and it's narrower than what we're seeing in the children. So if they only just devote some time, they can get
Really?
this corrected. Yes. So that's the difference between children's brains and older, students' brains,
Yeah.
right, when it comes to this kind of processing
You
difficulty.
know what's really, and hopefully people who listen or watch this at some point, I actually hope that that serves an encouragement because there is a lot right now in kind of out there about the negative sides of AI. And there are real risks with AI. I will
Right.
absolutely, anybody who's listened to my content for a long time knows I am very aware of the risks and things like this. But it's stories like these that get me really excited about the really positive and encouraging things we can do with AI.
Mhm.
Because going back to your point of eliminating the shame associated with this, I mean, this individual that I got to know, I was like, wow, you have carried this your whole life.
Mhm.
Like that is really, really hard. But in the past, it was, but what could you do about it? So
Mhm.
even talking about it, it
Mhm.
was like, well, what really, but now it's like, well, don't just talk about it to feel better. You can actually get a solution to some of these things. And that's extremely exciting and encouraging.
And when we talk about AI, especially the news, there's this thing about bias. But here's
Yes.
the flip side of it, right? Because if somebody comes to Dissolve AI and gets an evaluation, the computer doesn't care who you are and how you got
Right.
the problem. All right. And so in that sense, there is no bias from this kind of
Yeah.
AI.
There's no
Right.
stigmatism to it
No,
because it's like,
not
just come do
right.
it and we'll
And just
just
go and
objectively
fix
tell
it.
you.
Yeah.
What's interesting, I spend a lot of time focusing on AI for just skill development and coaching and things like that. And I talk a lot about that.
Mhm.
And to your point with that, it is interesting how people feel more psychologically safe being assessed and analyzed by artificial intelligence
Mhm.
because it's not a person looking at you going,
Right.
I'm making judgments
Right.
about you based on this.
Right.
It's literally just artificial intelligence looking at what
Mhm.
you're doing and saying, I mean, based on this, here's the objective report
Mhm.
because it's been specially trained to look for those patterns that you described at the very beginning of this.
Right. And, we can think about good AI when it comes to solving really, really big, intractable problems. But our kind of AI is also different from what people are talking about, right? Because
Yes.
ours is what our CTO calls siloed AI, because it's custom built just to
Yes.
work on this problem, right? And so it's domain specific, and it doesn't look at internet data because that can be untrustworthy and unreliable,
Yep.
and you get really skewed results, right? No, Dissolve AI generates its own data from just the gameplay by the users and then analyzes that. So in the years to come, I would see that we're going to have more and more of this siloed AI, right? The
Oh,
experts will come in and just do more and more of this. Yeah.
for sure. And I think that's one of the things that does create some unsettling things with people right now. And I get it because some of these big, large language models and,
Mhm.
they're so broad and so diverse and pulling from such a wide data set.
Mhm.
They're good for general stuff,
Right.
but for highly specialized things like what you're talking about, like
Mhm.
analyzing somebody's
Mhm.
brain pattern to determine if they have dyslexia. You don't want a generic large language model assessing that. It's not going to do a
Mhm.
good job. But
Right.
these specialty AIs that are trained and targeted on very specific applications, I've been blown away with their potential and what they can do. So I think it's awesome that you're ahead of the curve. And I talk to tons of people who are in the AI space. You're ahead of the curve on specialty AI, which to me is an emerging market that is growing out of artificial intelligence.
And it's really coming out because of dire need, really,
Yes,
right?
it's
Because
solving a
it has to
problem.
solve the problem for, especially when we've done this, directly with families. We see what it is like in their home lives. So
Yeah.
if there's a solution and we can actually, struggle through 10 years and build this, we'll do it.
Well, and I think, one of the things that's exciting and encouraging about what you talked about is the fact that, again, it's not that in the past people didn't care about people who struggled with this. It was extremely difficult to do anything about. And because it's not the majority of the population, I worked in pharmaceuticals for a while.
Mhm.
And so just the analogy of this was you had orphan drug status, where it was like there's certain diseases that there's just not a lot of people who have it, and it's very difficult to diagnose. So it's hard to get big pharmaceutical companies to invest in the research and all this other stuff
Mhm.
to do something where there's a small percentage of people they can solve.
Mhm.
And I think some of these things that we're talking about, it's a similar challenge, but what technology is doing is it's saying, hey, we actually have the capability and the scale to do this now, where 10, 15 years ago, it would have just been much, much harder and too difficult to actually take on.
Right. And just so that people realize how much we're spending on special ed in this country is over $80 billion a year. So this
Wow.
problem affects everyone and not just the 20% of the population that has dyslexia. It's $80
Yeah.
billion. A lot of our money.
A lot of money. And as we said before, a lot of money going to things that aren't delivering
Right.
better outcomes.
Right. Right. And the human cost is much greater than that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Forget the $80 billion. The
Yeah.
impact on people's lives
Right.
for, whatever
Mhm.
is massive. So how did you end up? I mean, you gave me a little bit of your background, but how did this become something that was such a passion point for you to want to try and solve?
Yes, I've always been interested in the brain, right? And that's why I went
Okay.
to linguistics. It's one of the original cognitive sciences, right? And I took a mission in linguistics seriously that I want to understand how those outputs from people, especially
Okay.
children, will tell me something about the brain. But I've always liked working with children. But when I get to this particular population where they're having all these struggles, it's really very upsetting, right? To see that the parents were going all over the place, getting very frustrated and desperate. And there are lots and lots of tears, because the schools couldn't help them. And the schools had to lock out a lot of families because it's just too costly to accommodate all the children, right, who have these difficulties. So
Yeah.
then, that's how I got pulled into it, right? Because I see how much it's really hurting so many families. And you know what? We also see a lot of single moms because sometimes it's so stressful, it just tears families apart.
I can
Yeah,
completely see how it
yeah.
would destroy the fabric of a family
But
potentially.
we also have fathers who are very invested in, helping their children, stepdads too. So
Yep.
it's surprising, right? Who would actually do that kind of work, right? When nobody else would help them, right? Who's the
Okay.
family member who would just keep on looking
Okay.
for a solution? Yeah,
Okay.
that's how we got pulled
Now,
in.
so I'm actually curious. Now, is English your first language?
You can tell from my accent. No,
Well,
no.
but hey, I never know because sometimes people have accents and it is their first language.
Right,
But so
right.
even
No.
just understanding, learning the English language, like I've talked to a lot of people where
Mhm.
the English language is a very like stack on top of a cognitive disorder. Then you've got the English language, which is a very quirky and
Yes.
interesting language to have to
Mhm.
deal with on top of it. Like
Right,
there are challenges on top of challenges on top of
right,
challenges for
right.
these students.
Yes, yes. Right. So yes, it's not my native language, and I started
Yeah.
speaking it only when I was 14. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Interesting. So you not only have won a specialty in this area, but you've actually gone through that journey too of having to relearn, I mean, basically relearn a new language as
Right.
part of this as well.
Mhm. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Language is
Interesting.
fascinating, and it's really mysterious because when you look
It
at the
is.
language or linguistic system, is really a conglomeration of many many codes together, and they're different kinds of
Yeah.
codes. So it's really hard to solve this problem
It's
if
a
you
very
understand it.
complicated that
Yes.
that's where when large language models started coming out,
Mhm.
I don't think people understand the power underneath language
Ah,
and and how powerful language is into every aspect of, I think sometimes it's easy to take for granted, well, I speak or I talk or I write and you're like, "Oh, I don't think you even understand the way you describe and the way that connects to the way you do things and all
right,
this stuff." Language
right.
is almost the fabric underneath really our existence in many ways.
Mhm. Yes. And
Okay.
yes, and so yes, it can be the connective thread for thoughts. So then, when we see very young children, right, toddlers, just playing with phones and they're just scrolling through YouTube videos, I worry about that coherence of thought that they may not develop later.
Yeah. Well, because again, going back to it, and this just, I love, I tend to think about stuff way too much, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about how even the way you think has to do with your language, because you don't, you think in terms of, you're putting language to everything, even that's going through your head, which again, the complexity gets huge. Now, I guess my next question to this is,
Mhm.
what are some of the resistances or the challenges that you face with moving this forward? Because everything we've described so far, it seems like people would just go, well, obviously we should do this. But I know it doesn't work that way. So what are the challenges that you sometimes run into with people where you're going, hey, we've actually fixed a problem. We've made it scalable. We can make the world a better place with this. What challenges do you run into when it comes to that?
Right. So, Christopher, I guess then we'll have to talk about how we're going to deliver it to all
Yeah.
students, right, as quickly as possible. You have 13
Okay.
million of such students at least, right, in this country. The
Yep.
way to do it is through the public school system, right?
Okay.
And so then what kind of resistance are we facing, right? There are also reasons why they may not adopt. They say, oh, we got to see how it affects the curriculum. It doesn't. It doesn't affect the curriculum because this doesn't have to do with skills and content.
Right. Because like we said, this is the fabric underneath it that's just
Right,
connecting the wiring. We're not
right,
talking about the curriculum and the
yes,
skills and the taxonomy of that.
right. And then it has to do with purchasing decisions, right? So some school districts have already committed to certain programs. They've already put a lot of money in for not just this year, but following years. Then it sort of crowds out what may be actually a more cost-effective solution for them, right? So there are also some other things that are coming in the picture, but schools that have adopted Dysolve, right? Like the principal would say, it's completely non-intrusive, right? And she's telling the teachers, right? Because it doesn't impact what the teacher is doing. All the teacher needs to do is for those couple of students to put them in the corner, right? And have the headphones on and let the students just play, right? While the teacher attends to other students, with differentiated instruction. So it's completely non-intrusive. You don't need to train teachers. There's no orientation whatsoever because the child just plays one game at a time, and that Dysolve AI takes care of everything. So where's the resistance, right? I guess it's the old mindset that if you introduce a new program, it's going to be like a lot of effort, a lot of change to the system. They just have to get past this, right? Even though this is advanced, it's very complex behind the scenes. We make it so
they're
that
not feeling that complexity.
child.
Yes, it's super complex on the,
Right.
but that's on the back end. That's not something
Right,
that you're
that's right.
experiencing on the
So they
front
have
end.
to change the mindset as to how new things work now.
It's funny you bring this up, because we joked backstage. You were like, sometimes like I ruffle some feathers with this stuff. And I'm like, well, you're talking to the right person, because I've ruffled many a feather in my career. But it is interesting how powerful the status quo can be, and how much people will hold to something they know doesn't work. Like you said, people, maybe they won't publicly say it, or maybe they're a little shy about saying it, but like, we all know it doesn't work, but it's what we're familiar with. It's what we're comfortable with. And so you're trying to change something that goes against what people have done before. And I think you're probably also dealing with some of the compounding challenges of, it's unfamiliar technology, and people just naturally seem a little bit resistant and afraid of, oh, what's the catch, or what's it really doing type of a thing. But from everything you've described to me, this is just more an awareness and an education, and helping people understand what you're doing and how these pieces come in, because ultimately you could solve a problem better than you could before, through more cost-effective measures than what it would take to take a traditional path. I mean, that seems relatively obvious to me.
Right, right. And then for schools, right, they care about state testing
Yeah.
results, right? So then
Yeah, they do. They're
fantastic, right?
incentivized based on it.
Yes,
This is how they get their funding, is based on how
right,
well students do.
right.
So
So
improving student outcomes
just
isn't
on
just
that
good for
alone,
students,
right?
it's
It
good
makes
for the
sense.
district.
Yes, it makes sense, right? But I think also you have to get past the idea that, oh, this is just a job, right? For us, it's like, we're doing it for the children, right? So even if we have to go out of our way, even we have to just drop our routine and do something new, and so putting the effort that is for the children, right? They have to see it that way, right? So it can't be like, oh, the school year is going to end, right? So then let's just let it end like that. And that's the other problem, right? Everybody's going by the school calendar. This problem does not fit into the school calendar. You got to have the child work on it for really 1 year, right? It depends, right, on the severity of the problem.
And I think the unfortunate part that you just hit on there is that, and here's the part people won't always like, but I'll just say it, is so often we're so focused on self-preservation and our own, like what we have, that we aren't always thinking about what's in the best interest of other people around us. And the like, listen, this might cause, I mean, what you've described, some minor disruption to yourself, but minimally invasive at best. But it's a disruption nonetheless. And sometimes our desire to preserve what I'm doing and not have to change anything can actually lead us to, and unfortunately, and the audience we're talking about here, usually it's the vulnerable people who are the ones who are the victims of this. And that's exactly what we're talking about, going, I mean, most kids are fine and I don't really want to change my routine. It's like, well, but it's the vulnerable folks who are the ones who are actually suffering for this. And the suffering is long standing beyond the next school year. Well, I'll just pass them off to the next teacher. They'll just go on to the next grade. I don't have to deal with it next year. But it's like, but that's the problem, is it's exponential, because then it just continues going and the problem just gets bigger and bigger.
That's what we talk about in our book, right? Because you can let the problem go for 1 school year, right? And then it gets passed on to somebody else, right? And that's the thing too about the families that enter the public school system with their first child. They don't realize what has happened to the families that went before them.
Yes.
Right. And so you have to ask those questions, right? If you're going to give me this kind of intervention, right, what were the outcomes before, right? Did you get good results? Right. So then they don't feel, pacified, right? Satisfied, whatever they get as some temporary solution, right? So ask those questions.
Well, and I think so as a dad of 7, this is a very personal thing for me as well, because as I think about this isn't just about helping teachers and administrators and educators understand this, but also parents who are raising children who can advocate for their kids and say, there is a better way. I'm not going to accept this is the best we can do, because I know there is a better way. So don't tell me there's nothing else we can do, because I know there is. Where in the past, it would have been like, well, there isn't a better way. This is how it gets done. Where now it's like, well, no, there is a better option. And if you're aware of it, you can actually help drive awareness to that, to hopefully drive change.
And Christopher, then I should point out to all the parents, because not all parents realize this, that there is a law, right? The IDEA Act that mandates that if a parent or family member, right, guardian, suspects that there's a disability, then the child has to be evaluated and appropriate educational intervention services would be given to that child, right? So they have that right. Not everybody knows that right, right? So they have to push, right? And not next year. Don't wait next year, right? Even if it's like January or March, don't let them say that, okay, let's push it to next year. Don't. Have them do the evaluation right now. And Dysolve evaluation is so less, so much more effortless than what they're doing currently, so that they cannot accommodate everybody. Then you can get the results in just 2 weeks. Then you can, fight for what your child needs after that. So everybody, all parents should know this, that they have that right.
Yeah. So I'll ask for some of the other folks who may not be in the public school system, like, is this something that's then accessible? Because I have a lot of friends, and again, COVID, I think, pushed this, who are homeschooling, who may be doing school. Is this something that's then accessible to the average person who may, or even like we said, there may be adults who have struggled with this their whole life and are like, oh my gosh, you're telling me there's a way I might be able to
Right.
make forward progress. So this isn't something that the only channel is through the public school system. You're
No.
just saying, hey, we recognize that's a huge channel. So we want to drive it through that. But also, this is something that's readily available to anybody.
Yes, a couple of things I should mention, right? So if they go to dysolve.com, dysolve.com, and just
Okay.
contact us if they have questions and ask that, right? But the other thing is that even for students who are not in the public school system, their school district may still be required to provide them services. And then in some states like Arizona, families are given a certain amount of money to spend.
Okay.
As they choose, right? So
Okay.
then they can do it in various ways, but really the school district should be paying for something that is appropriate for
Okay.
a child with disability.
Well, and now if you've listened or watched this, you know there is a better way. I mean, what's funny about this is normally I don't spend quite as much time talking about the product itself and what you're doing. But this one in particular, when I see things and go, there's a better way. Technology is unlocking a door that has historically been locked shut. Like we have not had better ways. I get really excited about this because this is the kind of stuff that I think there's so much opportunity as we look at the future and what's possible to be able to say, what a fantastic way to positively impact the lives of children or anyone with a cognitive disorder like that who has been struggling with it. So I absolutely love it. I really do. It's sincerely impressive. And I love that you've taken your passion for linguistics, but taken it and thinking beyond just linguistics and thought about, hey, but how does the technology intersect with this? And how can we use this to solve a real problem in the world and make the world a better place?
So I hope people realize that even if it's a neurological condition, it doesn't mean that you have to live with it for the rest of your life, right? It can be corrected now. So there's hope, right? And I hope families, parents push forward for their child.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Well, I don't think I could end on a more inspirational, positive note than that because I love when I can end an episode with hope and say, "Hey, we recognize that you might be here, but it doesn't have to be that way,
Mhm.
and there's a pathway forward." So, Dr. Coral, I so appreciate you joining me on the show. I hope everybody who listens and watches this, again, whether it's you directly or someone you know, there are better ways. There are better ways. We're closing the gap, and what an exciting way to use technology to change the world for the better. So, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Christopher.